Story 1. So when I was a kid, I got a huge kick out of hiding in various spots around our house and then going out and scaring my mom or my sister whenever they would walk past. The challenge was finding new spots that they wouldn't see coming, but that I knew they would be at. I wanted to get a good scare, but I didn't want to have to wait an eternity for someone to come by. This only happened once, and it still scares me when I think about it. I had picked a spot in our attic on this day. I knew my mom would be coming up there because she was going to get out props for a church play that we kept up there. So I set up behind a stack of boxes and waited. About 5 or 6 minutes in, I heard someone very faintly say, as if my being there was interesting and maybe unexpected. The sound came from almost directly behind me, and I immediately froze. Then I felt a breath on the back of my neck. Now I was raised on a farm, and the number one rule when encountering something that you assume you have no control over, coyotes, lynx, snakes, and the occasional irritable cow, is to not make any sudden movements. Then you slowly remove yourself from the situation and create distance without provoking whatever you are faced with. So I sat there for about 20 seconds, stock still, absolutely terrified. After that, I slowly stood up and started to move away. I wasn't about to turn and look behind me. I got 2 steps and a hand clamped down on my right shoulder. I screamed, wrenched away, and ran until I was out of the house. Once outside, my mom and my sister came running to see why I was screaming. They had been outside with our dogs the whole time. My dad was at our other property almost 10 miles away. Sure, I could have imagined it. It never happened again. Nobody believed me then. My mom and dad both made multiple trips to the attic to show me nothing was up there. I don't know what it was, but it was something. Story 2. As a kid, various relatives used to take me on trips to zoos, museums, amusement parks, movies, etc. On one of these trips, my grandfather took us, kids, to the movies. Now, these old movie houses date back to the days when they had live stage entertainment, vaudeville. This old theater my grandfather took us to had an orchestra pit, even though it's never been used in decades, seeing as how vaudeville has been dead all that time. I was following my grandfather in the area between the front row seats and the orchestra pit, when just out of curiosity, I peeked into the orchestra pit. There was no floor. One could see into the basement. But on the basement floor was... Well, you ever heard of the old Humpty Dumpty poem? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, etc. On the floor of the basement was a large man-sized egg with a happy face painted on its shell. It had arms and legs. It was on its back, flailing its arms and legs as if it were trying to stand up but couldn't due to its egg shape. I looked away at my grandfather for a second, then looked back into the orchestra pit. This time, the painted expression on his face changed. Now the painted expression was one of grief and frustration. The eyes were closed and the mouth was in a grimace. I looked away for a brief second or so and looked back into the orchestra pit. This time there was no egg, just the bare floor of the basement. I looked away again, just for a few seconds, I guess looking to tell someone what I saw, but then looked back into the orchestra pit. This time the orchestra pit floor was there. I couldn't see into the basement anymore. The orchestra pit floor had only a small handful of wooden folding chairs on it. Nothing else. As the years passed and I was going to the movies on my own, sometimes I went to that very same theater again. Every time I did, before the movie started, I'd go take a look into the orchestra pit. But I never saw anything like that again. Just the plain old bare floor of the orchestra pit. That old theater is now gone. A typical victim of the expansion of home video and cable TV. Story 3. I've had 3 different bizarre experiences in my lifetime. 1. East Central Tennessee. I was young, around 7. My sister was 5. We were living in an Amish community in the middle of nowhere. Caves are numerous. Our room was on the 2nd story. Every morning there would be a creature. Once in a blue moon, there were 2 that would fly by our window. It would perch on a tree not far from the house. Sometimes we would hear it land on the roof. As kids, we thought it was in the attic. But thinking back, it was just landing on the roof. But what was this creature? It was hairless, but not a bat. It had a large head crest and a long mouth beak thing. For lack of a better word, it was a small pterodactyl. My sister and I didn't have a concept of what a pterodactyl even was, but it was incredibly real. So real that my parents believed us. My dad showed us that it wasn't in our attic, but it didn't change the fact that at dawn most mornings there was some kind of creature there. My parents never saw it themselves, but my mother heard wings flapping once when she came up because we were calling her that it was in the attic, aka had landed on the roof. 2. I don't know if I can call this a mythical creature, but strange. I became a substitute teacher for several counties in North Florida. One morning I was driving to a school early in the morning. The sun was already well up, it was not dark. I was on the phone with my boyfriend and suddenly saw something, or rather didn't. There was a shape flying over the highway in the opposite direction I was driving. I say shape because it was invisible. You could just make out an outline of some kind of flying object due to how the sun was reflecting on it. The best way I can describe the shape was vaguely like a military drone. It was too small for there to be a person inside, so I imagine it was remote controlled. As it and I got closer, it seemed to shift in a way that stopped the weird sun reflection on it, and it disappeared. I've never gotten a good explanation for what that was. 3. My most recent mythical creature was a doppelganger. I got married to the boyfriend that I mentioned previously. He and I moved to North Central Texas due to his job, and I became a stay-at-home wife so I could work full-time on a paper that dismantled the background of a specific Christian denomination, not Amish LOL. My husband was getting up at 3-4 a.m. for work. I stayed in bed and slept in. I started experiencing sleep paralysis, which was terrifying. Rather, I'm chalking it up to sleep paralysis because everything else just scares me. The first incident was strange. My husband and I were in a one-bedroom apartment, but we had converted the bedroom into a full working office, and our living room was our bedroom. The bed was near the front door. You would open the door, and the foot of the bed would be to your left. I was laying in bed starting to stir when I heard the door unlock. I opened my eyes and saw my husband walk in. He seemed very frustrated, almost angry, which was highly unlikely for him. I asked him what he was doing home from work, and he snapped at me. I tried to sit up and realized I could not. I was overwhelmed by what I can best describe as a malevolent spirit. It was like something was sitting on my chest. I could no longer see my husband, but I could hear him looking for something. He found whatever he was looking for and then left, locking the door behind him. I felt myself get very drowsy and I drifted off. I woke up sometime later feeling disturbed. I got in contact with my husband, who was working for a major private company that is contracted to do government work. I asked him if he had been by that morning. He said no. I had no reason not to believe him. At the time, I thought it had just been a very vivid dream. However, that was not the only time. His doppelganger would show up frequently in the mornings after he had left. Sometimes I would feel extremely afraid, other times violated. Sometimes he would crawl in bed with me. Other times I could feel him breathing on my face. I could never move my body during these encounters, and I could only open my eyes when he would initially walk through the door. The closer he would physically get to me, the more my eyes were forced to close. He never abused me in any way though. We changed our sleeping arrangements, and I got on a better sleep schedule. My husband got off overtime shifts and was able to be home during the time frame his doppelganger would show up. The doppelganger, unsurprisingly, didn't make another appearance. That is until we moved. We moved to another apartment. And my husband got a new job, though in the same vein as the last. For a little while, he was working bizarre shifts, and some mornings he had to leave very early. I remember hearing the door unlock and hearing his footsteps walk through our apartment. However, the difference was that I could feel the same presence as before. The last day the doppelganger ever showed up was around 2 years ago. This time I heard the door open and multiple entities entered. I was filled with more fear than ever before. They felt genuinely evil. They were there to hurt me. My entire body was trembling. I also could feel the doppelganger there. Despite him still feeling malevolent, I could also feel that he was feeling protective of me. The bedroom door opened and the doppelganger was arguing with the other entities. I remember him distinctly saying that they were not allowed to hurt me. The entities did not speak direct words, but I could tell that they had been attracted to me because he kept showing up. He drew them there, intentionally or not. He told them he would never come to me again if they left. They fought and argued, but eventually there was some kind of agreement. They all left through the front door. I got up out of bed. My bedroom door was open and the front door was unlocked. Bizarre because I had locked the door when my husband had left for work that morning, and I always closed the bedroom door. The doppelganger has never appeared since then. I'm not sure what to make of all this. Story 4. I was snorkeling in Ireland a few years ago when out the bottom corner of my mask I saw a light, like my visor was lit up like someone had shown a bright torch up at me. When I turned in its direction, I found a small fish sitting on the seabed, and it was incredible. It had a longish serpent-shaped body that was bright gold and shiny, but more beautiful were the fins that jutted out of its sides. They were like large peacock emerald fans, each one as long as it's the body and wide. The entire animal shone like it was lit up or like it was made out of shiny metal. You know when metal just catches the light right and reflects it at your eyes? It was that sort of effect. But there was more luminosity than its small size made sense for. It glowed. I wouldn't have believed it was real, except it moved its fins or tail lazily every so often. When I took out my snorkel and dived towards it to investigate more, I suddenly realized I was out much deeper than I intended to be. And the small fish was probably not that small at all, but large and just far away. The difference between 6 feet and 20, where I was snorkeling, is quite famous for riptides created by the swell, framed by 2 rocky outcrops. I panicked a little and surfaced. The beach was stressfully distant, and I had been gradually dragged out. I tore myself away from the fish and headed back. I was shaken. When I got back, I explained what I saw to my dad, who is an expert all things ocean and angler. He kind of waved away what I said about it glowing, but was stumped by my description. He thought maybe a weird colored, I guess he thought I was exaggerating the intensity of its coloration, Gurnard, but I'm very familiar with them, and it was the wrong shape and wrong everything. I even grabbed a pen in frustration and drew it. I still have the drawing somewhere, and he couldn't account for it at all. I searched the internet, books, everything, and never come across anything like what I saw. I don't know what it was, maybe a rare species or, like my dad said, some very rare coloration and mutation of one. But I can see it in my mind still, and honestly, it was like bumping into a mythological creature. It was that stunning and unreal. It wasn't golden, it was gold and lit up the sea around it. I'm not exaggerating, and time hasn't just built it up in my head. I know what I saw, I just can't explain it. Story 5. Back in the summer of 2013, I worked at the Pomona Valley Hospital. Hats off to the men and women who help serve the sick. I was a contracted guard, didn't do much other than standing around on the graveyard shift, and the only place that ever stayed busy was the ER. It always had something going on. I mean, this was Pomona. Nightly stabbings, car accidents, and various other things that put your insides outside were normal. Anyway, one night, like all the rest, I was standing guard by the ER doors, directing visitors and anyone else that needed assistance. Then early that morning, maybe around 3, I honestly don't remember, a patient in a gown walks through a set of double doors that normally only open for doctors with a badge. I figured a doctor buzzed her through as she walked right by me, looking lost and a bit confused. I called out and asked if she needed help to find something. She turned and smiled at me, and a rush of noise hit me as doors started moving and doctors started moving around their day-to-day. I blinked and she was gone. I called out over the radio about what I'd seen, and the control checked the feed. Sure enough, there I was standing out in an empty corridor, except when I called out, I was alone. What's twice as weird is that night had been particularly busy, and that 5 or so minutes I experienced never happened. I was very clearly awake in the video feed, looking around and doing my thing. The period that it took for the doors to open and for me to call out was a couple of seconds. I vividly remember the whole experience being a few minutes long. I asked around, never got a straight answer to explain it. Everyone's seen something through that hospital's old. Story 6. I used to see shadow people. They used to visit me all the time when I was a teenager, and every time it was terrifying. Roughly once a month, I would wake up inexplicably in the middle of the night, absolutely terrified, as if I had watched a horror movie earlier and just had a nightmare about it. Except I had never woke from a nightmare when this happened. Every time I felt like someone was coming up the stairs to murder us all in our sleep, I would always cover my head with my blankets to make me feel a little safer. Most of the time, I would tell myself that I was being stupid, my overactive imagination was at work, and I would just roll over and force myself to go back to sleep, all without ever cracking my eyes open. There were 2 instances where I didn't do that, however. Once when I was 13, I woke up scared, and like usual, told myself I was being dumb and started to roll over, and my eyes opened in the process. My curtains were usually open to some degree at night, and if I didn't get good moonlight shining into my room, then it would be the light from the street lamp outside. Sitting above me against my wall, clearly outlined in the moonlight, was a tall, opaque, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. I was terrified, and then it turned and noticed me staring at it. Immediately it lunged at me, and I yanked my covers over my head. I didn't call anyone because I knew they wouldn't believe me. So I laid there shaking like a leaf, curled up in a tight ball, and holding my blankets over my head as if my life depended on it until I fell back asleep. From then on, every time I woke up scared, I knew it was one of those shadow people, and I made sure my blankets were over my head before rolling over. This continued for a few more years. Eventually, my brother moved out, and I moved into his old room, and the nights of waking up scared for no reason continued. One night it happened, my eyes accidentally opened just barely enough to see, but not enough that it was obvious my eyes were open. I saw very clearly in the street lamp light that came through my brother's window an opaque, shadowy figure standing beside my bed. It was standing closer to the foot of my bed, and it was at least 7 feet tall. It was staring down at me, not moving. Strange thing was that this one had pale golden eyes, instead of the red ones the previous one had. I didn't feel in immediate danger, but I didn't want them bothering me anymore. In the years since this started, I had done my research and discovered they were shadow people, and that they always came causing feelings of fear and dread. The one I always imagined in my head coming up the stairs to kill us was always the Hat Man, even before I knew what it was. But the ones I had seen were both hooded figures. I had also discovered that you could get rid of them by telling them they weren't welcome anymore. So that's what I did. I closed my eyes and told them to leave me alone, and it friggin' worked. That was the last time I ever experienced it. Every time I tell the stories to people today, they always dismiss it as, "Oh, you were probably just sleep paralyzed." Except for no, the hell I wasn't. I had never experienced sleep paralysis in my life until only a few months ago, and it was a vastly different experience from what happened to me as a teen. Story 7. My parents, my sisters, and I have all had separate and unique encounters with what we believe to be spirits or ghosts. My dad is the most surprising because he's a devout Baptist preacher and doesn't normally do the whole supernatural thing. That's not what I'm going to share, though. I believe in ghosts and spirits, but my story is something that I can't even explain. I was on my way home from cheerleading practice. I was probably 12, 13. My mom was driving, and I had invited my best friend to stay the night at my house after practice, so she was riding in the back seat with me. We lived in rural southern Ohio, and it was the time of the year when the sun began setting around 6 p.m. It was almost completely dark outside on our ride home. About 2 miles from my mom and dad's house, there's a big open field. That's 80% of Ohio anyways. In the darkness, I saw this creature in the middle of the field that looked like a kangaroo. It was about 5-6 feet tall, stood on 2 hind haunches, and moved quickly in bounding movements. I couldn't see any details on the face, or if it had hair or fur, etc. I thought I was just exhausted after practice, but then my friend turned to me and asked if I saw it and what it was. I confirmed that I saw it, and we both described it in the same way. There's no way it could have been a kangaroo. Even if there was an accidental zoo break, the closest zoo was about 2 hours away. We continued to randomly bring up our sightings over the next decade or so, and still could never make any guesses as to what we saw. I think about it a lot. Story 8. So I work at this really old school that's over 150 years old. There were always stories about past teachers dying there and such. Even one saying the principal could hear footsteps coming up the stairs to his office late at night from a ghost called the matron, a nurse who died in what was originally the first aid before it became the principal's office. The building I worked in allegedly had a ghost called John, I believe. I never fully believed in ghosts, so I thought, sure, when I was told of him. However, when I was packing up to go home, I was moving a vacuum cleaner and saw something in the corner of my eye. I thought it was one of the other people who worked there, but I saw this man standing not but 8 feet from me. He was a big guy too, just looking down at me from the shadows, dead silent. I freaked out naturally, but even more so when I blinked and he was just gone. Vanished. I ended up falling on my ass and was too scared to scream or even cry. I just remember slowly backing away from the corridor and slowly feeling for the steps of the first flight of stairs. I didn't even dare think of taking my eyes off of the place John had once been until I got to the platform between the flights and just jumped the entire flight and sprinted for my things and to my car. I had to take a moment to calm down because I was shaking so badly. I can't walk on the second story of that building without getting chills now. Story 9. Growing up, I've always been able to see what others can't. Spirits, apparitions, you get used to it eventually. Well, one day when I was about 13 or so, I was riding my bike in my neighborhood. And that's all I remember. The next thing I know, I'm waking up in a roadside ditch, covered in blood. It's on me and my hair and I'm lying in it. And there's this gray wolf with a feather hanging from its ear right next to me, nudging me, trying to help me get up. I do my best to figure out what happened, but I've lost so much blood, my flip phone is shattered, and my bike is bent and broken. With the wolf's encouragement, I make it about halfway home before passing out in front of someone's house. The next memories I have are of a hospital. I survived. I'll spare you the details of my recovery. They aren't for the faint of heart. Fast forward 6 years, I've met my boyfriend, now husband, and we are talking about supernatural occurrences. I share this story with him about the wolf and how he helped me make it out alive, and how no one else ever saw the wolf again, be included. He's listening silently. When I'm done, he just looks at me, then proceeds to tell me his own story. When he was younger, he could also see apparitions and spirits. He was particularly close to one though, a wolf with a feather hanging from his ear that he had named Ryan. One day when my husband was 18, Ryan suddenly offered him a choice. He could continue to have the ability to see these things or save the family he'd always dreamed of. He said he thought hard for a while, then chose family. Ryan nodded to him, then faded. That night, he had a dream of a woman with long dark hair, but he could only see her silhouette. My husband is 5 years older than me. My accident happened in the late fall, just like my husband's encounter did. I have long, dark brown hair, and my husband and I met at a theme park on New Year's Eve. I truly believe Ryan saved me so I could be with my husband.